The explanation didn't come as a single clear statement. It came in fragments, half answers, defensive clarifications, phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface but unraveled the longer you sat with them. When Eric finally began explaining why Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were separated, what he said mattered less than when he said it, and why he chose those words at that moment. For months before the split, the story had been consistent. The family was struggling, yes, but they were surviving. The home was rough, but it had always been rough. The routines were familiar. The people involved insisted that improvements were coming, that help was ongoing, that stability, however imperfect, was still there. Then, almost overnight, the language shifted. The same conditions that had been filmed, shared, and normalized were suddenly described as emergencies. What had been presented as manageable became untenable. What had been framed as hardship became immediate danger. That pivot is where Eric's explanation begins, whether he intended it or not. When asked why the separation happened, Eric didn't start with Timmy. He didn't start with Ray. He didn't start with Lorraine. He started with pressure. He talked about the situation getting too big. He talked about scrutiny. He talked about the fear of things being misunderstood if outside authorities stepped in without context. The emphasis was subtle but revealing. The concern wasn't just about the family's condition. It was about how the condition would be interpreted and by whom. According to Eric, the decision wasn't sudden. It was the result of mounting concern. He said he had been trying to manage too much on his own. He said he reached a breaking point. He said he realized he couldn't carry the responsibility anymore. On paper, that sounds like honesty. But buried inside that explanation is an admission most people missed. Responsibility for what? Exactly? Care? Safety? Or accountability? Because the truth is, the living conditions didn't dramatically change in the days leading up to the split. There wasn't a fire. There wasn't a medical emergency. There wasn't a violent incident. What changed was the attention. Donations were being questioned. Timelines were being scrutinized. People who once supported quietly were now asking loudly for clarity. The same footage that once generated sympathy was now being rewatched as evidence. That's when Eric's role began to shift from helper to gatekeeper. In his explanation, Eric framed the separation as an act of protection. He said the family needed professional oversight. He said the environment had become unsafe by any standard. He said continuing as things would have been irresponsible. But when pressed about why those standards suddenly applied now and not months earlier, the answers became less direct. He spoke in generalities. He leaned on emotion. He referenced stress. He avoided timelines. And timelines matter. Because if the conditions were truly that dangerous, the question isn't why the call was made. The question is why it wasn't made sooner. Eric addressed that indirectly. He said he believed he could fix things. He said he thought progress was happening. He said involving authorities earlier would have made things worse. Worse for whom was never clearly defined. What is clear is that once outside scrutiny intensified, Eric's margin for error disappeared. Every choice he had made up to that point, every promise, every delay, every unfinished plan was suddenly vulnerable to reinterpretation. In that context, the state stepping in didn't just remove the family from the home. It removed Eric from direct responsibility. Oversight shifted. Liability shifted. The story shifted. Eric has said that once the professionals were involved, everything was out of my hands. That line is important. It's framed as resignation, but it also functions as insulation. If decisions are no longer yours, neither are the consequences. He has denied acting out of self-interest. He has said repeatedly that he acted out of concern. And it's possible that concern existed alongside fear. Human motives are rarely clean, but concern does not erase sequence, and fear does not explain strategy. What complicates Eric's explanation further is how prepared everything seemed. Paperwork was ready. Officials arrived with documentation already completed. The removal itself was efficient, almost procedural. That doesn't happen spontaneously. That happens after consultation, reporting, and coordination, which means the decision was not made in a moment of panic. It was made days earlier, possibly weeks. During that time, the family was not informed in any meaningful way. There were no goodbyes, no preparation, no transition. Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine experienced the separation as an abrupt rupture. Eric experienced it as the conclusion of a process. When Eric explains the split, he often emphasizes how hard it was for him, how painful it felt, how much weight he carried. That framing has drawn criticism, not because his feelings are irrelevant, but because they center the wrong subject. The people who lost their home, their routine, and each other were not the ones doing the explaining. They were the ones being explained about. There's also the matter of language. After the split, Eric began using phrases he had rarely used before. He described the family as unable to care for themselves. He described the home as beyond repair. He described the situation as something that could no longer be managed informally. Each phrase moves responsibility outward. Each phrase suggests inevitability. Each phrase makes the outcome feel unavoidable rather than chosen. And yet, those same phrases raise another uncomfortable question. If the situation was truly beyond informal management, why was it informally managed for so long? If the family was unable to care for themselves, why were they repeatedly filmed doing exactly that? If the home was beyond repair, why were repairs promised instead of intervention requested? Eric's explanation doesn't answer those questions directly. Instead, it reframes them. He suggests that intentions matter more than outcomes. That effort should outweigh results. That try should count for something even when it fails. But systems don't work that way, especially systems designed to protect vulnerable adults. One of the most telling parts of Eric's explanation came later, in a quieter moment. He said he felt trapped. He said no matter what he did, someone would accuse him of doing the wrong thing. He said the call was the only option left. That sentence is revealing, not because it's necessarily false, but because it frames the decision as reactive rather than proactive. It suggests the separation was less about what the family needed and more about what Eric could no longer withstand. That doesn't automatically make him a villain. It does, however, complicate the hero narrative. The separation of Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at the intersection of vulnerability, visibility, and pressure. Eric's explanation focuses heavily on the first. The public's questions focus heavily on the last two. And until those are addressed honestly, the explanation will always feel incomplete. Because at the center of all this are three people whose lives were disrupted without their consent, whose voices were never part of the decision-making process, and whose story is now being told by others. Whether the split was necessary, overdue, or mishandled is something reasonable people can debate. But pretending the decision was simple, sudden, or purely altruistic doesn't survive scrutiny. This isn't about assigning guilt. It's about understanding cause and effect, about recognizing that good intentions do not cancel poor judgment, and about acknowledging that when you take responsibility for vulnerable people, you also take responsibility for the timing and consequences of your choices. Eric has explained why the split happened. What remains unresolved is whether that explanation fully accounts for the reality of what came before it. Comment below. After hearing this part of the explanation, do you believe the separation was unavoidable, or do you think it happened when it did for reasons that had more to do with pressure than protection? As Eric continued explaining why Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were split apart, the story began to narrow around one central claim: that intervention had become unavoidable. He framed the separation as the last remaining option, the point where informal help could no longer substitute for formal authority. But when you lay his explanation alongside the actual sequence of events, a different picture starts to form, one where inevitability looks a lot like escalation. Eric said he reached a point where he felt overwhelmed, where the responsibility of coordinating care, managing donations, and responding to public attention became too much for one person. That admission matters because it quietly reframes the situation. It suggests that the breaking point wasn't triggered by a sudden decline in the family's condition, but by the accumulation of external pressure. The family's needs didn't spike overnight. The scrutiny did. One of the most revealing aspects of Eric's explanation is how often he references being in the middle. He said he was caught between supporters and critics, between expectations and reality, between what people wanted to see and what he believed was possible. But being in the middle is only a problem if you're positioned as the center. And that's where the ethical tension emerges. The role Eric stepped into, whether intentionally or not, placed him as the primary filter between the family and the outside world. He wasn't just helping. He was mediating access, information, and perception. When questions about the home intensified, Eric said he felt the situation was being misrepresented. He argued that viewers didn't understand the complexity of the family's needs or the limitations of what could be fixed quickly. That may be true, but complexity doesn't negate responsibility. In fact, it increases it. The more vulnerable the people involved, the more carefully decisions must be made and explained. Eric has said that he feared the family would be taken anyway if authorities became aware of the conditions through third parties. In his telling, making the call himself was a way to control the narrative and ensure the best possible outcome. That's a critical point because it implies strategy. It suggests the call wasn't just about safety. It was about timing, framing, and influence. Control of narrative is not inherently malicious. But when narrative control intersects with vulnerable lives, it demands transparency. And that's where Eric's explanation starts to strain. He described the home as deteriorating, the situation as unstable, and the risks as mounting. Yet these descriptions surfaced most prominently after public trust began to erode. Prior to that, the same environment was presented as improvable, if imperfect. The shift in language wasn't subtle. It was decisive, and it happened in parallel with increasing demands for accountability. Another part of Eric's explanation centers on burnout. He said he couldn't keep going back. He said the emotional toll was unsustainable. That matters because burnout is real and it can impair judgment. But burnout doesn't absolve responsibility for how transitions are handled. It doesn't explain why contingency plans weren't communicated. It doesn't explain why the family wasn't prepared for what was coming. Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine didn't experience the separation as a carefully considered intervention. They experienced it as an abrupt removal. Eric has said that he didn't want to alarm them prematurely, that he feared telling them would cause distress. But distress caused by anticipation doesn't outweigh distress caused by shock. The absence of preparation suggests either avoidance or a belief that their understanding didn't matter. That belief, whether conscious or not, is one of the most troubling implications of Eric's explanation. When you decide that people don't need to know what's about to happen to them, you're making a judgment about their agency. You're deciding whose understanding counts. Eric has insisted that professionals were better equipped to handle the situation. He's emphasized that once authorities were involved, the family would have access to resources he couldn't provide. That may be true, but professionals don't arrive in a vacuum. They arrive because someone initiates the process. And the reasons given for that initiation matter because they shape how the case is handled. If the primary concern was immediate danger, the timeline doesn't fully support that claim. If the primary concern was long-term sustainability, then the lack of gradual transition becomes harder to justify. Eric's explanation oscillates between these two rationales without fully committing to either. There's also the issue of benefit. Eric has rejected the idea that he benefited from the separation. He said it brought him nothing but stress and criticism. But benefit isn't always material or emotional. Sometimes benefit is relief. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's the shifting of responsibility to a system designed to absorb it. Once the state stepped in, Eric was no longer the primary point of contact. He was no longer responsible for conditions, care, or outcomes. The very scrutiny that had become unbearable was redirected. That doesn't mean the decision was made in bad faith, but it does mean the decision had consequences beyond the stated goal of protection. Another key part of Eric's explanation involves inevitability. He suggested that the separation would have happened sooner or later, regardless of who made the call. That claim is impossible to verify. What can be verified is that it happened at a moment when pressure on Eric was peaking. That correlation doesn't prove motive, but it does complicate the narrative. The language Eric uses when discussing the family after the split also deserves attention. He speaks about them as cases, not people. He references placement, oversight, and compliance. That shift may reflect the influence of professionals, but it also marks a distancing. Once the system took over, the family became something managed rather than something known. What's missing from Eric's explanation is a sustained acknowledgement of loss. Not as loss, but there's the loss of routine, the loss of familiarity, the loss of each other. Those losses are not incidental. They are central to the impact of the separation, and they're largely absent from his framing. This doesn't mean Eric acted with malice. It does mean that his explanation prioritizes justification over reflection. It explains why he felt compelled to act, but it doesn't fully grapple with what that action did to the people involved. There's a difference between saying, "I had no choice," and saying, "I made a choice under pressure." The first removes agency. The second accepts it. Eric's explanation leans heavily toward the first, and that's where skepticism arises, because choices made under pressure are still choices. And when those choices affect people who cannot advocate for themselves, the standard for justification is higher, not lower. The question that remains isn't whether Eric felt overwhelmed. It's whether that overwhelm should have dictated the outcome for Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine. It's whether alternative paths were truly unavailable or simply less convenient. And it's whether the explanation we've been given accounts for the full reality of the timing, the preparation, and the aftermath. So far, Eric has explained why he acted. He hasn't fully explained why it happened then or why it happened that way. Comment below. Do you think burnout and pressure justify the way the separation happened? Or do you believe there were other options that weren't seriously pursued? When you move past Eric's explanation of pressure and burnout, the focus naturally shifts to what didn't happen. Not the dramatic moments, not the phone calls or the arrival of officials, but the quieter decisions that shape outcomes long before a crisis becomes visible. Because separation is rarely a single act. It's usually the result of a series of choices, delays, and omissions that narrow the path until only one option appears left. Eric has said he felt trapped by circumstances. But feeling trapped doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when alternatives are either dismissed, delayed, or never seriously explored. And this is where the timeline becomes crucial. For months before the separation, Eric continued to document the family's living conditions. The same floors, the same rooms, the same routines. There was no sudden fire, no medical emergency, no reported incident that forced immediate action. What did change was the conversation around responsibility. Viewers began asking harder questions. Supporters began requesting proof. Skeptics began compiling timelines. That shift matters because it reframes urgency. Urgency driven by danger looks different from urgency driven by accountability. One demands rapid intervention. The other demands explanation. And when explanation becomes difficult, intervention can feel like relief. Eric has described feeling like he was the only one trying to help. That belief is important because it can justify unilateral decisions. If you believe no one else will step up, you may convince yourself that whatever you choose is better than inaction. But belief isn't evidence, and it doesn't replace collaboration. There were other actors in this situation. Volunteers, local contacts, professionals who could have been consulted earlier, advocacy organizations familiar with disability and rural care. Eric has not explained why those routes weren't pursued more visibly or more persistently. He suggested they were insufficient, but insufficiency is not the same as impossibility. One of the most striking gaps in Eric's account is the absence of a transition plan. Even when separation is necessary, preparation is standard. Conversations, gradual adjustments, familiarization with new environments. None of that appears to have happened here. The family wasn't eased into change. They were removed from it. Eric has said he feared that telling them would cause distress. But distress is not harm. Shock can be, and shock was the outcome. There's also the question of consent. Not legal consent, which may not have been possible, but emotional consent. Being informed, being respected, being treated as participants in decisions about their lives. Eric's explanation doesn't show that those principles guided his actions. It shows that efficiency did. Efficiency is seductive under pressure. It promises resolution. It simplifies complexity. But with vulnerable people, efficiency can become erasure. Their preferences, fears, and attachments get pushed aside in favor of what moves fastest. Another layer to examine is the power imbalance. Eric wasn't just a helper. He controlled access to information, to donors, to the public narrative. That power comes with responsibility, especially when the people affected can't easily challenge decisions. When Eric says he couldn't keep going back, he's describing his own limits. But those limits didn't erase his influence. They amplified it. There's also the matter of framing after the separation. Eric emphasized improvement, clean environments, regular meals, structure. Those things matter. But improvement in conditions doesn't automatically equal improvement in well-being. Disruption can carry its own costs, especially for people who rely heavily on routine. What's missing from Eric's explanation is evidence that those costs were weighed seriously. That someone asked, what will this do to them emotionally? Not just, what will this fix? Fixing conditions is tangible. Preserving emotional stability is harder to measure, but it's no less important. Eric has portrayed the separation as inevitable, but inevitability is often constructed in hindsight. It's easier to say there was no other way after the path has already been chosen. Before that moment, there are always forks. Choices to slow down, choices to ask for help, choices to share responsibility. The question isn't whether the system can provide better conditions. It's whether the system was engaged in a way that honored the humanity of the people involved. And that's where Eric's explanation feels incomplete. He's spoken about fear of being blamed. That fear is telling. It suggests an awareness that conditions could be interpreted as neglect. If that awareness existed earlier, why wasn't it addressed earlier? Why did improvement efforts stall at documentation rather than transformation? One possible answer is scope. Fixing structural poverty isn't something one person can do. But acknowledging scope should lead to partnership, not isolation. It should lead to transparency, not narrative control. Eric's explanation also avoids discussing how the family understood his role. Did they see him as a helper, a friend, a caretaker, an authority? That perception matters because it shapes trust, and trust shapes trauma. When someone you trust initiates a process that removes you from your home, the sense of betrayal can be profound, even if the outcome is safer. The separation didn't just move bodies. It fractured relationships. It altered identities. Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine weren't just relocated. They were redefined, from family members to wards of the state. That shift carries stigma, loss, and confusion that no amount of improved infrastructure can fully erase. Eric has said he did what he thought was right. That may be true, but doing what feels right isn't the same as doing what is right, especially when feelings are shaped by pressure, fear, and scrutiny. What we're left with is a pattern. Documentation without transformation. Urgency without preparation. Protection framed through removal rather than support. Responsibility shifted rather than shared. This doesn't make Eric a villain, but it does make him a central decision-maker whose choices deserve scrutiny. Not because he acted, but because of how and when he acted. The deeper issue isn't Eric's intent. It's the system that allowed one person to hold so much influence over the fate of 3 vulnerable adults without robust checks, collaboration, or transparency. That system failed long before the separation, and Eric's actions, intentional or not, became part of that failure. As we move toward the final part, the focus shifts again, away from Eric's reasoning and toward the aftermath. What separation actually changed, what it solved, and what it broke. Because explanations are only meaningful if they align with outcomes. Comment below. Do you think the separation prioritized efficiency over humanity, or do you believe the emotional cost was unavoidable given the circumstances? What happened after the separation is where the story stops being theoretical and starts becoming measurable, because intent, pressure, and explanations all collapse under one question. What actually changed for Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine once they were no longer together? The answer is complicated, and that's what makes this ending uncomfortable. On paper, the changes look positive. Cleaner environments, regular meals, medical oversight, structure, safety checks. Those are the benchmarks institutions use to define improvement. And in many ways, those benchmarks matter. They address risks that existed for years and were never fully resolved. But human lives don't run on paper. For people like Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine, routine isn't just comfort. It's regulation. It's how the nervous system stays stable. Sudden change, even into better conditions, can feel like loss rather than rescue. Familiar sounds disappear. Familiar faces are gone. The rhythms that anchored each day are replaced by schedules they didn't choose. This is where the gap between protection and trauma opens. Reports indicate that the family members were separated into different placements. Not just removed from the home, but removed from each other. That distinction matters. Being taken from a house is one thing. Being taken from your people is another. Ray, whose communication relied heavily on proximity and familiarity, lost the few individuals who understood his cues without words. Timmy lost the role he held within the household, however imperfect it was. Lorraine lost the environment she had known her entire adult life, including the objects and spaces that regulated her anxiety. None of those losses show up on inspection checklists. Eric has framed the outcome as necessary, even if painful. But necessity doesn't erase consequence, and consequence doesn't disappear just because conditions improve. The question becomes whether the harm caused by separation was acknowledged, mitigated, or simply accepted as collateral damage. There's little evidence it was meaningfully addressed. In the weeks following the removal, communication became restricted. Information was limited. Updates were filtered through official channels. That's standard protocol, but for people already prone to confusion and fear, it can feel like abandonment. For those left behind, especially Betty, it created a vacuum filled with uncertainty and grief. Betty's situation deserves special attention here. She wasn't removed, but she was separated from those she had lived with and cared for decades. Her role shifted overnight from caregiver to outsider. That loss of purpose can be devastating, especially for older adults whose identities are tied to caregiving. Eric has not spoken extensively about this impact. His explanations focus forward, not sideways. But accountability isn't just about what you fix. It's about what you break along the way. Another unresolved issue is trust. Trust in helpers. Trust in outsiders. Trust in systems. The Whittaker story had already been shaped by exploitation, attention, and broken promises. The separation, regardless of intent, reinforced the idea that visibility leads to loss. That when outsiders intervene, families disappear. That lesson will outlast any improvements in housing or hygiene. There's also the broader consequence. This case didn't just affect one family. It shaped how audiences understand intervention in vulnerable communities. Some viewers now see removal as the default solution. Others see it as proof that help always comes with strings attached. Neither interpretation is healthy. What's missing from Eric's narrative is reflection on power. Not legal power, but narrative power. He helped define what the public saw, what donors believed, and what authorities eventually acted on. That influence doesn't disappear just because responsibility is handed off to the state. Power without accountability is dangerous, even when exercised with good intentions. Eric has said he couldn't keep going. That may be true. Burnout is real, but stepping back doesn't require stepping over. There were ways to reduce involvement without triggering a full separation. Those options weren't seriously explored in public, and that silence matters. The final consequence is silence itself. Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine are now largely absent from the narrative. Their voices, limited as they may be, are no longer present. Decisions continue to be discussed about them, without them. That pattern hasn't changed. Only the setting has. So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with a case where conditions improved but agency diminished, where safety increased but connection fractured, where one form of harm was addressed by introducing another. And it leaves us with a question that no explanation has fully answered. Was this the only way? Eric's story frames the separation as the end of a crisis. But for the people most affected, it wasn't an ending. It was a rupture, one they didn't consent to, didn't understand, and didn't prepare for. The truth is uncomfortable. Multiple things can be true at once. The home was unsafe. The intervention addressed real risks. And the process still caused harm. Acknowledging that complexity isn't an attack. It's responsibility. The real lesson here isn't about one person's failure or heroism. It's about how easily vulnerable lives can be reshaped by decisions made under pressure, without sufficient safeguards for dignity, continuity, and voice. If there's accountability to be had, it doesn't end with Eric. It extends to the systems that allowed this situation to fester for years before intervening. To the audiences who consumed the story without demanding better structures. To the platforms that amplified visibility without protection. And to anyone who believes that good intentions are enough. They aren't. What Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine needed wasn't just removal from danger. They needed sustained, collaborative support that respected their humanity as much as their safety. That opportunity was missed long before the vans arrived. And now, all that remains is to decide what this story becomes next. A cautionary tale, a justification, or a turning point for how we intervene in the lives of people who can't advocate for themselves. That decision doesn't belong to Eric alone. It belongs to everyone watching. Comment below. Do you believe the outcome ultimately helped the family, or do you think the cost of separation outweighed the benefits? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.